Is this watch here a fake watch, a modded watch, or a Frankenstein? Or is it some blend of the three? And better yet, why would a good portion of us balk at a watch like this one right here? So this watch right here is an Explorer 2 in every regard. The entire movement, the case, the hands, the dial, the case back, the crystal, the mid case, these are all Explorer 2, but the bezel has been removed and in its place, a retaining ring that is usually found on the GMT Master 2s or 16710 was added to hold the crystal. This then allowed for a click spring, a bezel, and a bezel insert of the Rolex GMT Master 2, which could be added to the watch. And then now you get this look right here. Now, each of these additional parts is genuine Rolex, made by their factory and by their hands or their machines. So is this watch fake? Is this watch a Frankenstein? And what is the actual value retention to Rolex? To discuss that, we have to go a bit deeper. So I have a watch enthusiast friend who's always loved the Explorer 2, much like mine, and he's also always loved the Pepsi GMT. And last year when the Tudor Albino GMT came out, he was inspired to replicate the look. When he reached out to see if I wanted to talk about it, I saw it and I thought this was right up my alley. I started to wonder about why some would categorically be shocked and appalled by this watch, and more specifically, why most would shake their heads regardless of whether or not these are actual OEM parts. For a moment, imagine a world where a Rolex employee messed up. They accidentally put a Rolex Explorer dial and handset on a GMT Master case. That watch, we probably would assume would have a premium because of its unique nature. Whereas this watch here, made with the exact same parts, but was done after the fact, we likely would value this watch less than a normal Explorer 2 or a GMT Master 2. But the question is why? When my friend had this done, why do we think that he did the wrong thing? Or a lot of people think that. Do the hands that actually do the change matter that much? Or does the timing of when the change happened matter that much? Or is it really just about the story? The difference, I think, has to do with how we collectively seem to value these little ticking things and exactly what we decide to use as a value to associate with them. I'll give you an analogy. We all know the guy who's modded his car into oblivion to the point where most of the stock parts no longer exist. We also probably know a guy who's been fixing up an old car, and we would describe it as fixing. We typically mean sourcing new parts for it. And they may not be from the original equipment manufacturer or OEM. They could be generic parts that do the exact same purpose. We also know the guy who's dropped an upgraded suspension or lift kit in an engine to a car because he wanted to upgrade it. Cars, like watches, are an asset class, but cars, unlike watches, have horrible value retention on average. The more they're used, the lower the value gets, and then eventually they're unable to be fixed and they're sent to a scrapyard and to be compressed and sold back down into raw materials. Now there's exceptions to that in older classic cars, which I'll get into. I believe this devaluation is why someone who fixes up an old car body and puts all new exhaust, all new chassis, all new engine and internals like AC or DVD player, which weren't original to the car, can hold value sometimes more than just the sum of the parts. So that leads to a question. Would we value a car with the exact same engine, interior, even if they're a bit worn or it's missing AC or it runs like, the cars used to in the 60s where it just burns gas like crazy, over the exact same car body that's been fixed up with a brand new engine and interior? I suppose it depends on who you are. And I think most would prefer the reliability of a newer engine unless they had deep pockets and could service that car or place the older car somewhere to rarely be driven, basically as a museum piece. The same can be said to be true for watches. Watches are an asset class, to be sure, but they're niche. And that niche nature allows the values that are accepted to be more directed by those who have the most money. I also think watches can appreciate the older they are, even with the old engines or movements inside them. Because unlike cars, they can continue to be serviced for much less money and a lot easier than just swapping out the entire engine or the entire movement. I think this is where watches lean more into art. Art and paintings are another asset class, often enjoyed by the very wealthy. And these two things above all are valued in art: originality and the name of the man or woman who painted it. Now I know there's style in there as well, but a lot of that gets associated into the name of that painter or the style of that painter. And I believe the model of art has mistakenly been transplanted into watches. See, this Rolex Explorer 2 here is not seen as a viable modded watch by many because it isn't original. See, despite the owner having the correct bezel in his house, being able to swap it back to this watch here, this look is seen as an affront because I think it scares people. Imagine a painting that has a history that everyone loves. It's beautiful and the artist is renowned for their efforts. But one day, a rumor goes around that the painting was once used as a transfer of value in a drug deal rather than cash, which is another way that art is used as an asset class. For some, this story would drastically change the value down. For others, the uniqueness of this story would increase its value in their eyes. Now take the same story, but instead the rumor is that this painting here might be a counterfeit. Now the painting is likely now to be devalued on all accounts unless it can be verified. See, now Rolex, the largest manufacturer of watches in the world, doesn't do any verification, unlike brands like Omega. Unless you can count their certified pre-owned business model, but I don't count that because that's a way that they make money. And because of that, the verification is distributed down. That verification carries a huge premium. And not only that, the people with the money are the only ones buying these expensive old things, for the most part, in that certain price range. And these are also people who typically can pay to service the watch. Much like the man who can pay to continue to service the old car, a watch is even easier to store for that man and easier to service. So he likes the parts to be original, almost like a museum piece or a piece of art on his wall to be admired and potentially not even used. On the other hand, a Seiko enthusiast that likes to mod his watch or change out the bezel or swap out a new dial or case, no one seems to mind. And I think the reason is because that watch has an original lower starting value. There's less risk in the community in actually buying a Frankenwatch Seiko or a modded one because, you know, the actual loss of value if you accidentally buy one is lower, and so no one seems to care. But as soon as the price of the watch starts to rise into the thousands, modding a watch is seen as poor taste. Because I think it adds to the fear element of any one of us accidentally purchasing a fake watch, because I think we believe these assets are going to rise higher than they really are. And I think all this kind of conflates together to create this nature of wanting things to be original and perfect just because that's what's said by those who sell them at auctions. And if you're not planning to sell it at auction, does it matter? We say keep the Explorer 2 as original, and someday, if it's in good condition, it might be worth a lot of money. But if you look at this chart, that isn't exactly how all this works these days. If we look back from the 70s until now, Rolex's push from expensive, every man's watch into luxury meant that from 1973 to today, they raised prices on average of 6% a year across all model lines, plus inflation, which means that the average return from the 70s until now would look similar, albeit a little less than you would from the S&P 500. So that makes you say, well, that's great. I should buy the watch and put it in a safe, and I could have my money stored, and I'd make more money than I would in the S&P, but I have a tangible asset. But if we look at the same numbers from 2007 to today, the retail prices, sure, have gone up substantially, but that's pretty much all inflation. The actual rise in pricing on an average retail base was 1% on average plus inflation. What that means is that if this trend continues like it has for the last over a decade, you can expect a 1% real return on your investment if you keep that watch pristine and in its original retail space. Now, again, if you look at a mint condition watch that's aged a certain amount, yes, you can get more than you would from a retail current model, but if it's been worn, a lot of times you'll even get less. So I guess it depends. If your plan is to buy something, sit it in a safe for the next 2 decades, then yes, you should be able to get a pretty good return depending on the number of watches that were produced in that specific model line. If you buy something and you plan to actually wear it, actually use it, you shouldn't really expect much, if any, of a real return on your investment in several years other than just inflation keeping up and maybe even still some devaluation to the actual asset. It will retain its value, but it won't make you any money. So I guess in the end, the question is, how do you plan to use it? If you plan to set it in a museum, of course, you should keep it original. If you plan to set it in a safe, the same thing exists. But if you plan to actually wear it every day, does it matter if you plan to personalize it? But not only that, almost every other attainable brand other than Rolex depreciates over the years on average, so I might as well plan on enjoying the watch. See, most of the watches, especially now, are produced in such incredibly large numbers that they're likely not going to outperform the S&P 500, or even conventional government bonds at 1 to 2%. Now, to be clear, I don't have an answer for you. I think this watch is a really cool look. I actually thought that my friend was doing something that I admired. He had his watchmaker swap out all these parts with original OEM parts from old GMT masters that had broken, and it made a different looking watch. Just because a certain number of Rolex designers didn't sit in a room and agree, yes, we should try and sell a rotating bezel on an Explorer 2, it doesn't mean that it makes it awful. If he plans to eventually sell it in its original form and not in this form, then he has all the means to do that. Now, if someone is selling this saying this is a mistake from the Rolex factory, and this actually came out of the factory looking like this, well, then that's a lie. And that story would carry a premium that I think is unacceptable. But I think this overall question of watch modding and changes to watches and personalizing your watches is something the entire community has to discuss and decide over time. Originality is cool, mint condition is great, but it all depends on how you want to use your watches. I think people should be allowed to do whatever they want to do with their watches. Replace a bezel, DLC coat, diamond encrust it if that's what they want to do, if that is what brings them enjoyment. And just because a room of Rolex designers didn't bless it doesn't mean that the owner can't enjoy it. The only caveat is that if you are reselling this, don't say something it is that it isn't. Don't call this a piece unique or a mistake in a factory. And to everyone else out there that sees something like that, don't believe them. But the real question is, what do you think? Is this an abomination, or is this just an owner having some fun? Till next time, peace.